morning, everyone. Howard Williams was a great paediatrician, inspired by the vision that the health of children was the basis for the health of the nation, and indeed for its whole social well-being. He determined as a young man to devote his career to the advancement of paediatrics. He was one of the first to see that it was necessary to establish paediatrics as an independent medical discipline, and that its future leaders should be trained in both high-quality research and exemplary clinical care. Leaders who would share his vision and in turn share it with future generations of medical students and paediatricians. He graduated from the University of Melbourne in 1935, and after an uneventful internship at the Melbourne Hospital, progressed to the Children's Hospital and remained there for the rest of his career, apart from service with the RAAF in New Guinea. After the war, he was invited to fill the newly created post of Director of Clinical Research at the later Royal Children's Hospital. Howard Williams was a founding member and later President of the Australian Paediatric Association, 1976 to 1977. He was also the President of the Thoracic Society of Australia, 1974 to 1977. His outstanding contribution to paediatrics and child health was recognised by his being made an Officer of the Order of Australia. Each year at the RACP annual scientific meeting, the Paediatrics and Child Health Division acknowledges a person who's made a similar outstanding contribution to this field in Australia or New Zealand by inviting them to be the Howard Williams Orator and the recipient of the Howard Williams Medal. Today's orator is Professor Elizabeth Elliott AM, Distinguished Professor in Paediatrics and Child Health at the University of Sydney and Consultant Paediatrician at the Sydney Children's Hospital Network, Westmead. Elizabeth is an academic paediatrician with a national and international reputation for leadership in medical research, education and advocacy. Her focus is children with rare diseases, children in immigration, detention and developing settings, and Indigenous children. Elizabeth founded and leads two national surveillance systems, the Australian Paediatric Surveillance Unit for Rare Childhood Diseases and the Paediatric Active Enhanced Disease Surveillance System, and has led the international network of paediatric surveillance units. She holds a prestigious NHMRC Practitioner Fellowship, is a consultant for the Australian Human Rights Commission and for the World Health Organisation, and is a member of the Order of Australia. Elizabeth will speak to us today on a journey in search of child health from Dien Bien Phu to Fitzroy Crossing and Christmas Island. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome Elizabeth.
Thanks, Sarah, very much for that introduction, and thanks, Stephen, for that lecture. It's made me worried about getting old. One of the most rewarding parts of my career over the last 10 years has been working with Aboriginal people, and I want to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, their ancestors, past and present, and of course their children who are our future. I'm honoured to have received the Howard Williams Medal. As Sarah said, Howard Williams was a distinguished paediatrician. Last time I shared this podium, I was speaking at the opening ceremony of the International Paediatric Association meeting in 2013. This was hosted by the college and I was chairing the scientific meeting. There we welcomed nearly 4,000 paediatricians, mostly international, and I hope that in the future we'll capitalise on that success and show a role in education and research leadership in the region. Before it was fashionable, Howard Williams advocated for evidence-based paediatrics. He also recognised what he said was the inescapable, important familial and social factors in paediatric research and practice. And in these two sentiments, our interests are aligned. I edited one of the first textbooks of paediatric evidence-based medicine, and in recent years have been preoccupied with addressing the links between disadvantage and child health. As Sarah said, Howard Williams was a founding member of the Australian Paediatric Association, and I wondered what he'd be thinking today about the formation of a new Academy of Child and Adolescent Health. In giving this oration, it's a particular pleasure to follow in the footsteps of some of my mentors, who many of you will know, particularly Kim Oates, David Henderson-Smart, Fiona Stanley, and Margaret Burgess, and I thank them for the strong shoulders on which I've stood. But wearing my gender lens, it's evident that paediatrics has not yet reached equality. Only 5 of the 28 medal recipients since 1990 are female. However, we could make up for that if we awarded the medal to a woman for every one of the next 23 years. So that's a challenge. As a member of the Sydney University Science in Gender Equity Advisory Group, I know we've got a long way to go in medicine. At my university, the gender pay gap is 18% and only 27% of professors are women. And to redress this imbalance, we're participating in the Athena Swan program to promote women in STEM, science, technology, engineering, medicine and mathematics. Now, my aim today is not to bombard you with a lot of research data, but to take you a part of the way along my journey in search of child health and to tell you some of the stories of children that I've met along the way. This, I hope, will illustrate the challenges we face to achieve child health and touch on some of the solutions. And in referring to child health, I use a definition proposed by NUTSHO, the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, that health is not just the physical well-being of an individual, but the social, emotional, cultural well-being of the whole community, in which each individual is able to achieve their potential, thereby bringing about total well-being of the community. Above all, I want to emphasise the importance of a healthy start to life. On Saturday, I spoke at a meeting of the Behavioural and Developmental Paediatric Association, and we talked about the impact of early life trauma, not only on childhood outcomes, but on later outcomes in adulthood. Whether directly or through epigenetic mechanisms, we cannot underestimate the impact of early life trauma on later health. In Australia, you could argue that we've arrived at our destination of child health because overall health has never been better. We have highly trained paediatricians, universal vaccination, sophisticated therapies, and good outcomes. We ventilate babies as young as 23 weeks, as small as my hand. We repair complex cardiac lesions and replace non-functioning livers. Infant and child mortality rates are low. However, many Australian children continue to live in extreme disadvantage, with poor healthcare and poor outcomes. The sombre facts outlined in recent royal commissions and inquiries have sent shockwaves through our community. Take, for example, the Royal Inquiry into Institutional Child Sexual Abuse, the Commission into Abuse on Juvenile Detention in the Northern Territory, and parliamentary inquiries into fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, domestic violence, and the harmful use of alcohol in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. That, on top of the Australian Human Rights Commission inquiry into children in immigration detention centres. These leave us in no doubt that we have a long way to travel. The question for clinicians is how can we enable health in these groups? And the RACP will shortly launch a policy on inequality in child health, led by Sharon Goldfeld and Sue Wolfenden, which proposes some responses. The importance of a good start in life was evident to me when I first began working in developing communities, ironically the first being the East End of London. Nothing was yuppie about Hackney in those days, where 75% of the population hailed from the Indian subcontinent. They lived in poverty, gastroenteritis was rife. This was a bonanza for an aspiring paediatric gastroenterologist, and it was the impetus for my doctorate on oral rehydration therapy. Mary Poppins fans amongst you will know that just a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. For 3 years, I worked at St Bartholomew's Hospital in the lab of Tony Dawson, who had discovered that the addition of sugar to a saline solution promoted water and solute absorption, and that when taken orally, this enabled both prevention and treatment of dehydration. ORS worked even in secretory diarrheas such as cholera, all but eliminating the need for IV fluids. We worked in search of the ideal oral rehydration solution, and I'm pleased to say that to today the low osmolar, low sodium solution that we developed are still used. And I can recommend Gastrolite for anyone who overindulged at the gala dinner last night. The Lancet described oral rehydration therapy as potentially the most important medical advance of the century because it reduced child deaths in the under fives from 5 million to 2 million per year. It also appeared on the front cover of Time, but this cheap and effective therapy has not been taken up in developed communities such as Australia, where we continue to use unnecessary intravenous fluids with their inherent iatrogenic risks. Our failure to use such proven therapies puts unnecessary strain on health budgets and puts children at risk. Children are at risk also of a poor start in life from lack of access to healthcare. And this is exemplified in my work with the Hoc Mai Foundation in Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam. Historians amongst you will know that this is where Colonel Giap defeated the French in 1954. When she was attending the 50-year celebrations in 2004, the New South Wales Governor, Mary Bashir, met the head of the Vietnam Women's Union. This is an organisation with 13 million women. This impressive woman told her about the extreme high maternal and infant mortality rates in Dien Bien Phu, and she in turn persuaded me that we must respond. And since then, we've run education programs for clinicians in maternal and child health throughout the Dien Bien province. Dien Bien Phu is a remote mountainous town in the north of Vietnam, 500 kilometres from Hanoi, but just 13 kilometres from the border with Laos. It's home to about 400,000 people, comprising 21 different ethnic minority groups. Most live in poverty and have been systematically neglected by the central government for decades. The People's Party up here remains very important. And there's only one provincial hospital with limited capacity. Just like in remote Australian settings, barriers to healthcare include poor access to services. Most health workers are men, and women are reluctant to consult men. There's no refrigeration, a problem for maintaining the vaccine cold chain, and there are limited training opportunities and education. As in remote Australia, there are also language and cultural barriers and poor health literacy. But interestingly, few women use drugs and alcohol in these communities. This slide shows the extent of the isolation. This woman collects fuel day by day, and she lives 60 kilometres from this dirt road by a foot track. This 15-year-old girl came 180 kilometres by foot and bike to the hospital for treatment of her child's pneumonia. So our education has focused on the major causes of maternal and child death, including management of this postpartum hemorrhage in the third stage of labour, infection, nutrition and resuscitation of the newborn. We have used small group interactive teaching in collaboration with paediatricians who act as interpreters from Hanoi. Many of them have become extremely prominent, including as head of the Children's Hospital in Hanoi. And we've used the train-the-trainer model to increase capacity locally. 25% of children in Dien Bien Phu are stunted, and this slide shows graphically the impact of poor nutrition in childhood on adult height. We're regarded as rather a novelty, and as one shopkeeper said to me, we don't sell clothes for giants. This long-term relationship has led to many other research and education programs in Vietnam, including a recent project to develop a surveillance system to document the epidemiology of cerebral palsy in Hanoi. As Sarah mentioned, the value of surveillance is dear to my heart. Indeed, the Australian Paediatric Surveillance Unit is a bit like my fourth child. I set up the unit in 1993, modelled on a similar system in the UK, and this research resource has facilitated active surveillance of up to 16 childhood conditions simultaneously. Each month, over 1,600 paediatricians receive a card like this or an email request, and they report whether or not they've seen a child with one of these rare diseases. If they report a case, then they provide de-identified data by electronic questionnaire. We have completed 62 studies on rare infections, rare genetic disorders, rare injuries, providing national epidemiological data which have informed policy and practice. Over 500 researchers have used this unit, and it has been very productive. But despite 24 years, we still don't have ongoing infrastructure funding. The Australian Paediatric Surveillance Unit is used by and dependent on the goodwill of paediatricians, and I want to take this opportunity to thank all of those of you who contribute for your contribution. Over 90% of Australian paediatricians have reported every month for over 20 years, returning over 450,000 of these report cards. But paediatricians tell us that the data that we get from the APSU is useful. It generates knowledge, it identifies research priorities, it informs policies, and most importantly, they say the data inform their clinical practices. And I just put this slide up to note this is where our paediatricians live and work. Most of them live on the edge, very few in the poorly serviced centre. Just an example of one recent APSU study is that of female genital mutilation in children. We know that over 200 million women live worldwide with FGM, but we had no Australian data, and we were requested to do this study by the government. We found that 10% of paediatricians had seen a child with FGM, 3% in the last 5 years, mostly in refugee clinics. Most of these children had FGM performed under the age of 10 and overseas, and many had severe complications. But paediatricians lack the knowledge of how to look for this, how to ask, how to classify it, where to report, whether to report to child protection, and what countries were in which the practice was prevalent. I just put this up to say that although we got 1,000 reads so far, it's only a recent paper from the Archives of Disease in Childhood paper, there have been 52,000 reads of this article in The Conversation, indicating to us the need really to get our data out, not just in medical journals, but to the broader public. And it's also interesting that the AMA position statement has very rapidly taken up this data and put it into their position statement. March 27 marks 50 years since the historic referendum in 1967, in which 91% of Australians voted that Aboriginal Australians should have the right to be counted in the census as humans, not as flora or fauna. Although I remember the disappearance of Prime Minister Holt in that year and the devastating Hobart bushfires, I've no recollection of this event nor its consequences, a sad reflection, I think, on the colonial bias in our education system. Some commentators contend that the positive and seemingly total commitment from the Prime Minister was lost in those rough seas at Portsea in December 1967. Our current Prime Minister, however, laments that progress in closing the gap is slow. He reaffirmed his commitment when he released the recent report in February this year, saying that closing the gap is a national responsibility that belongs with every Australian, that ending the disparity is complex and challenging, but this will not lessen our resolve. In 2017, there remains a persistent 10-year gap in life expectancy between Indigenous and non-Indigenous children. And although the child mortality gap has closed for the under fours, there remains a difference of 85 deaths per 100,000 children in this age group each year. The Aboriginal people of the Fitzroy Valley straddle two worlds, an ancient culture of 60,000 years and the imposed Western culture. With citizenship rights came the simultaneously dispossession of land, unemployment, eligibility for the dole or sit-down money, and access to alcohol, which is the genesis of many of the problems we see today. But what I want to tell you today is a good news story about the courage and leadership of Australian women in the Fitzroy Valley. In 2008, June Oscar and Emily Carter successfully lobbied for alcohol restrictions for the takeaway of alcohol in the Fitzroy Valley so that you can only take away light-strength beer, nothing stronger. This circuit breaker allowed the community to pause, and to their dismay, they realised that alcohol use in pregnancy was damaging their kids. In an address to the Australian Parliament, June said, "Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a tragedy that somehow transcends other aspects of grief and trauma. Here is innocent young life, the future of our people and all that goes with it, our culture, our language, deep knowledge of our creation and the laws of our country, being born into this world with brains and nervous systems that are so impaired that life for that person from birth to death is cruelly diminished. That year, leaders in the Aboriginal community developed the Maraloo strategy to diagnose and prevent fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and provide support for families living with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Maraloo is a word in the Bunaba language which means precious or worth nurturing, which is what the Aboriginal women feel about their children. Because I'd been doing a lot of work in fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, including an APSU study, I was invited to help with the work of doing a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder prevalence study with my colleagues Jane Latimer, James Fitzpatrick, and the Aboriginal leaders June Oscar and Maureen Carter. Working in the Fitzroy Valley has been a real reality check for those of us who call cities like Sydney and Melbourne home. Few of you, I suspect, have visited towns like Wonkajonka, Yakanara and Nunkanbar. Few have heard the language of the Wallamajari, Gunyandi and Bunaba people, and few could imagine what life is like for Australians living there. In the first part of our study, we used a diagnostic questionnaire to record basic pregnancy exposures and outcomes in a population-based sample of children. 97% of them gave consent to participate, and this is really because this is a project that was initiated and led by Aboriginal communities. So James Fitzpatrick, who was our paediatric trainee and PhD student at the time, travelled to 45 remote communities, always accompanied by an Aboriginal person to provide cultural guidance and language interpretation if necessary, and interviewed all the mothers and carers of these children. We found high rates of low birth weight, high use of hospitalisation, and lots of behavioural and learning problems. And of course, we found high levels of alcohol exposure. So if you look at this slide, you can see in green that almost 50% of these women did not drink alcohol during pregnancy. But on the right, those who drank at high risk levels. And what I mean by high risk is that mothers reported to us that they'd have 10 or more drinks either 2 to 3 times a week or 4 to 5 times a week. They were the most common drinking patterns. In stage 2 of this study, we did a multidisciplinary assessment of these children, including with a physio, psych, OT, speech therapist, ENT and ophthalmologist, and of course a paediatrician. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is an acquired brain injury due to the transfer of alcohol across the placenta during pregnancy, and it can result in structural damage to the brain, as an extreme example seen here, and of course multiple dysfunction to the brain. And not surprisingly, considering the alcohol exposure that we'd seen, 1 in 5 of the children we saw, using quite conservative criteria, had fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. But importantly, because we did a broad assessment, we were also able to identify and encourage the strengths of these children. But you can imagine that in a classroom with 20% of children with extreme behavioural and learning difficulties is an extremely challenging problem for teachers. I mentioned the impact of early life stress, and every one of these children had a stressful life. This included things like the death of a close family member, food and money insecurity, 16 people was the average in a house, a close family member in prison, drug and alcohol use in the house, etc., including involvement of child protection. And this is on top of living in an extremely remote location, some 500 kilometres east of Broome, often along inaccessible roads, where they also had to face cyclones, flooding, which is common. That's the hotel that we stay at usually. And the frequency of motor vehicle accidents and even plagues of grasshoppers descending on Fitzroy Crossing. Despite these difficult data, the community felt that this study was beneficial to the kids, families and community, enabling diagnosis and treatment, awareness of the harms of alcohol use in pregnancy, training for local people and health professionals, and parenting programs which we're now implementing in the Fitzroy Valley. And it also enabled the community to advocate for services. The community were praised for the courage in tackling this difficult disorder. They achieved some quite high profile because Quentin Bryce visited, being the patron of the National Organisation for Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders. They were complemented by the Social Justice Commissioner, Mick Gooder, who said this research is a genuine partnership, done not about the community, but with the community, and guided by a meaningful, respectful relationship, which is really what we should consider in all cases of research with Aboriginal people. He also encouraged us to take a human rights approach, acknowledging that every child is entitled to the resources necessary for full development, including healthcare and education. We were able to make a film during this study of a little boy called Tristan, who's living with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders in the community. And in this film, he said, I think I want to be a policeman, but first I just want to be normal. And he's one of many children living in these communities and facing an adulthood where he will be extremely restricted in what he can do to contribute to the community. We were fortunate to be invited to present this film at the United Nations at the 11th Forum for Indigenous Issues, which was a very good opportunity for the women from the community to understand that this is a condition that affects many Indigenous communities around the world who've suffered similar historic trauma and are using alcohol to hide that pain. And the community participants also appeared on a program in Insight which highlighted that this is not a problem just for Aboriginal communities, but a problem throughout our society. The data that were collected in this study has enabled support for continuation of alcohol restrictions in the Fitzroy Valley, and there was a recent challenge to this, and has also led to a better understanding of why Indigenous women drink. And in all cases, it's their underlying stress, disadvantage, overcrowding, domestic violence, lack of education and opportunity that's contributing to this high use of alcohol. It's also enabled the schools to develop alternative education pathways for children who are clearly not going to achieve academically. And it's enabled the development of resources for both health workers and teachers. New South Wales Health has used some of this data to develop resources for people working in Indigenous communities. And it's also identified that this is one of the high-risk groups for fetal alcohol syndrome, the others being children in foster and adoptive care, children with alcohol-dependent mothers, and of course children in juvenile detention. And the current Royal Commission into Children in Juvenile Detention is identifying that many of those children, most of whom are Aboriginal, have had alcohol exposure during pregnancy. As a result of this study and others that were going on, the NHMRC called for a targeted call for FASD research. And with this, we were able to develop the Junduyani U project, which is a positive parenting program, which is being run out throughout the Fitzroy Valley. We were fortunate also to get a Centre for Research Excellence funding for a research centre for fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. But probably what had the most impact from this small study in a remote community led by Aboriginal women was that the data was submitted to the National Inquiry on Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder. And when this report came out in 2013, it included a number of recommendations, most of which were taken up. And the best of which was that $10 million was allocated to a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder national action plan. And this has enabled us to develop a national policy group, a national clinical group, to develop a diagnostic guide for clinicians, a national website, a register. We've developed resources for women and resources for health professionals. And more recently, just before she left us, Susan Lay announced a further $10 million over 4 years to 2020, and specifically identified that the benchmark was the successful Fitzroy Crossing Murruloo-Lillilwan project in Western Australia, which was quite interesting. This type of work has also led to funding for clinics in New South Wales, Queensland and Western Australia. The data have been incorporated into the College of Physicians alcohol policy, and the AMA has also recently put out a policy on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. June Oscar, who's one of the leaders in this project, you may know, has recently been appointed as the Australian Human Rights Commission Commissioner for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. She said, we live in the best country in the world, and if we want to address our most challenging problems, we need to learn to embrace diversity and work together. In the Murruloo strategy, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people have achieved great things by working together, and in that process we have come to understand each other's worlds. She also said that while the situation in some Aboriginal communities is distressing, I feel a sense of great optimism when I see the groundbreaking world we have initiated. Our journey has taught us that Aboriginal people must take control. We can change what is happening in our community. So when you read the next media piece of the suffering occurring in communities like ours, don't think of us as victims. Rather, support us to be the architects of our future, a future in which every child has the right to be born healthy and to fulfil their potential. And the last step on my journey is Christmas Island. In 2014, I was invited to be a consultant paediatrician to the Human Rights Commission during the inquiry into children in immigration detention. And I accompanied Gillian Triggs, who we heard yesterday, to Christmas Island, where we interviewed 100 families with nearly 200 children. Our aim was to give those families a voice through the inquiry report. We had consent from the families to do so, and all the conversations that I'm going to report today are in the public domain. At the time of our visit, there were 14 women, mostly new mothers, who had self-harmed, and 10 were so severely impaired that they were under 24-hour eyeball surveillance, not by a mental health professional, but by a big, burly guard through an open door of their tiny cabin as they slept or fed their baby. Women had cut themselves, attempted hanging and suffocation, and were so profoundly depressed and withdrawn that they were unable to care for their young child. Tony Abbott had dismissed the self-harm as attention-seeking, retorting that the government will not succumb to moral blackmail. But as one mother of 3 said to me, "Enough is enough. I have had enough torture in my life. I have escaped from my country. Now I'd prefer to die, just so that my children might have some relief. I've reached the point where I want to hand over my kids. And I will do it, suicide, if my kids stay in this situation. And I already have a plan." Christmas Island is billed as a tropical paradise, and Gillian showed this slide yesterday. But Christmas Island was no party. It was a toxic environment, physically and emotionally. Only 300 kilometres from Jakarta, it was unbearably hot, humid, and dusted with phosphate powder from the mines, and populated by the most extraordinary range of animals, and humans, I might add. Mothers complained that the phosphate dust made their children wheeze and itch, and gastroenteritis spread quickly in the crowded conditions. Young children had nightmares about these giant crabs. They were absolutely enormous, up to a foot high. They're the biggest crustaceans in the world. Each month there is a report of robber crab road fatalities, and this is published, as you can see here. And as one father said to me, "It seems that Australians are more concerned about the crabs on Christmas Island than the people." The detention centre has high wire electric fences, security guards, and frequently children describe themselves as living in a jail. They live in small metal cabins, 3 by 2, 5 metres, that people call their home. Parents lamented the lack of space for children to develop and play. There was a lack of fresh food, loss of autonomy. Children were subjected to unnecessary force, and they feared assault. And you can see that these little containers don't even have a window at the front, so there's limited chance of socialisation unless you have the door open, and that means the air conditioning doesn't work. Despite this, there was no resident paediatrician, no child psychologist or child psychiatrist on the island. Children requiring health care were batched and sent by a hire jet when all the seats were full, and as a result, specialist consultations were often delayed for many months. The punitive approach included a head count 4 times a day, including early morning and late at night. It included not warning anxious parents that their child might be transferred to the mainland for medical care. Instead, under the guise of minimising the security risk, detainees were extracted from their accommodation without notice in the dark of the night and buzzed to the airport. A mother of one 5-year-old said, "They take families away in the night. We wake up and our friends are gone and our children are crying. Who would do this to a family?" Children have the right to preserve their identity, including their names, yet on Christmas Island, over 30% of children signed their drawings with a boat ID number. And as one 17-year-old said, "I feel like a criminal, a killer, when they use my boat number." Despite our obligations to provide education, we failed to do so for over 12 months on Christmas Island. One mother asked me, "Is it not a crime to have children here without school? Is it not a violation of human rights?" During prolonged detention without processing, parents and children alike lost hope and live in limbo. As one mother said, "The criminals, at least they know their sentence." I'm still haunted by the words of one young girl whose mother invited Gillian Triggs and I to visit their cabin. She was 12 and bore the scars of physical abuse from her homeland. She had witnessed a murder attempt on her mother, had spent 14 months in detention. Her mother had self-harmed. Her older brother was so depressed that he'd become mute. Her baby sister was failing to thrive. The girl had withdrawn, was refusing to eat, and was threatening self-harm. And when we arrived, there was just a small mound under a blanket on the floor. And for a moment, I thought she was dead. Before we left Christmas Island, she handed us a letter in which she had written, "My life is really death. I want to die because in death, I know I can't live here anymore. If I go back, I know they will kill me. How can I get free? I think stay in this room forever because if I stay in room, no eat, no drink, I will die. Better I kill myself." When we returned home, all of us had vicarious trauma. And I wrote an article called "Compassion Goes Missing on Christmas Island." There was certainly no sign of it there. In October of 2014, the Australian Human Rights Commission filed their report on the inquiry into children in immigration detention. Above all, the report confirmed that detention harms children. Many of the data were actually provided by the Immigration Department or the International Health and Medical Services, and they reported, for example, that 34% of children had moderate or very severe mental health disorders. In a 15-month period in Australian detention centres, there were 233 assaults involving children, including 33 sexual assaults, mostly in children. And during that same 15-month period, 128 children had self-harmed, with some children being assessed, deemed to be at high imminent or moderate risk and therefore requiring observation to prevent self-harm or suicide. The key recommendation of the report was that all families with children should be assessed as soon as possible and released into community detention or into the community on bridging visas. The report was tabled by George Brandis several months after it was submitted by the Human Rights Commission on the last possible day, and he said it offered little in the way of new insights or initiatives. And subsequently, you may recall that Gillian Triggs was vilified in the press, accused of fabrication and exaggeration, and asked to consider her position. The government was also disappointed and surprised that the Human Rights Commission did not start its inquiry into 2014. It was always intended that it would be done 10 years after the previous inquiry, but of course they were accused of being partisan. One cartoon noticed that Scott Morrison has a moral burden. It's very heavy. Sometimes it almost sinks his boat. He wishes he could stash it away out of sight. It can be hard to ignore, but he manages it. And I wonder this morning whether he's thinking that the role of Treasurer might be easier than that of Minister for Immigration. In 2015, I accompanied the Australian Human Rights Commission on a monitoring visit to Wickham Point Detention Centre out of Darwin, where there are a lot of children who'd been sent to Australia from Nauru for medical assessments. And there with my colleague, Dr. Hasantha Gunasekera, we assessed 69 children who'd come from Nauru. They'd spent up to 17 months living in Nauru, and it was evident that many of the problems and practices that I have described just now persisted in this detention centre. These were amongst the most traumatised children we have ever seen. 95% of them screamed at risk of post-traumatic stress disorder using a child trauma screening questionnaire. 100% of the children under 8 were deemed to be at risk of developmental problems. and this is the highest recorded in the literature, and 95% of them had the highest possible score for hopelessness. Now, in situations of adversity, if you've got some hopefulness, it's quite protective. If you're hopeless, you've got a much higher risk of mental ill health. These children described Nauru as hell on earth. The heat, the tents, the lack of privacy, the showers limited to 1 or 2 minutes, and the toilet and shower blocked some distance from their accommodation. Many had a palpable anxiety at the mention of return to Nauru. But following the release of our report, Dr. John Brayley, the newly appointed Chief Medical Officer for Border Protection, described our data as robust and admitted that the scientific evidence shows that detention deleteriously affects the mental state of children. Our findings suggested that the Forgotten Children report some months previously had fallen on deaf ears. When we asked teenagers on Nauru what they would like us to report to the Australian people, their messages were stark. One said, "The Prime Minister of Australia says he's saving our lives, but at the same time he is killing us." Another said, "I just don't want to see fence in my life anymore, no fence of any kind." Another said, "You can do anything to me, but don't send me back to Nauru." And finally, another said, "I just don't see a future. I honestly wished I had died in the ocean." One 7-year-old I interviewed was typical of the younger children who were less articulate. She was school refusing, food refusing, had weight loss, had headaches and tummy pains. She had night terrors and was sleeping poorly, waking and screaming at night, thinking that someone was going to come and take her back to Nauru. She had self-harmed. She'd got hold of a razor and cut herself, was socially withdrawn, had aggressive behaviour and suicidal ideation. And these are her pictures, her lonely journey in the boat. This is Nauru. All the people sad. We have in Nauru tents and we don't have any houses. The fan is broken and it's hot. We don't do anything. That's me dead. I died. My dad is sad. My mum is sad. She has a baby in her tummy. She's crying. And that's the fence and the locks. And then in the final one, I jumped from the house to the ground and I died. My mum and dad are crying. Some of you may have seen on April 26th the Sydney Morning Herald headline that a 9-year-old asylum seeker got compensation for her Christmas Island suffering. This was in the Supreme Court of Victoria, and the the court had ordered the Department of Immigration to pay an undisclosed sum to this girl who had been detained on Christmas Island for 10 months. As a key witness to this case, I can't discuss the details, but I was relieved that my many hours of work were not wasted. The legal precedent is important because about 35,000 asylum seekers were detained on Christmas Island between that year, between August 2011 and 14, which was the period covered by the claim. Perhaps this precedent will be the impetus for future governments to reconsider the way we treat children and families who seek asylum in Australia. It has been said that the Australian government has a Janus face when it comes to complying with the conventions such as the Convention for the Right of the Child, to which we are signatory. The internationally orientated face enjoys the international status it receives from being a party to these treaties, while the nationally turned face refuses to acknowledge the domestic implications of its international obligations. And as Gillian explained yesterday, what we don't do is incorporate the legislation from these international treaties into our local law, which really gives us very little power. So in conclusion, I hope you've enjoyed sharing my journey in search of child health, and that in telling you some of my stories, I've convinced you that paediatrics is a great career, that we can influence policy and practice and make a difference in children's lives, that we must embrace difference and we must learn from different cultures, and that we must never lose sight of compassion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I was struggling to think of the best way to summarise your talk, and I think that to say that it was inspiring and to thank you on behalf of all the children and the paediatricians for your advocacy work, I can't say any more than that. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to award you with the Howard Williams Medal. Thank you.